Welcome to the Literary Hangover. This is Matt Leck. With me, Alex Guns.
Hello.
And today we are doing Washington Irving and Rip Van Winkle. One of two famous stories by Washington Irving that people remember. I think that's about it.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Did he write one about the history of the Knickerbockers?
Yeah, that was the original one. It was like a history of the New York, a history of the Dutch New York or something like that.
Yeah.
Rip Van Winkle itself was a short story contained in Washington Irving's 1819 The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Cran, Gentleman, a collection of short stories like travel writings. I haven't read any of the others besides Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle, but I guess they kind of travel around Europe and stuff like that. Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle are... You shouldn't get the impression that this is an all-American collection of short stories. It's very European-oriented besides these two, but it's perhaps why these two were popular.
Hello. I'm Shelley Duvall. Welcome to Fairy Tale Theater. Tonight's tale takes us not to a land far, far away, but to America's Catskill Mountains. The setting for Washington Irving's mysterious classic about a peaceful fairy tale hero who liked to sleep. Rip Van Winkle.
Who liked to sleep?
I was just about to, that's an interesting summation of the story. It's an action-packed adventure of a man who loves to nap.
Yeah, just a dude who just loves
zonking the fuck out.
Getting his 8 hours in. It's not exactly about that. I guess. I don't know. Before you reread it for this, how was your familiarity with the tale? Like it was very fairy tale like. Like I wasn't really sure. I mean, I knew from English classes, but I think growing up, it seemed like some like old world-ish sort of tale. I didn't really think of it as like the first American story, I guess.
Yeah, it definitely had like a Hans Christian Andersen or Grimm's Brothers quality to it of... I don't know. It's kind of like, I don't know if I've ever actually read the actual text itself, but just imbibed it through other sources like Disney or just like him being around and like on the wall in various classrooms in like elementary school. And it's just like a story, and I don't even remember like my interaction with it other than like that would be insane. Like waking up super old.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Like there's something tactile about it, like a kid imagining having a beard because you don't even, I still don't know what that's like, but especially at like an 8-year-old, like not knowing what that is like, be like, oh, you'd be so old, your body would be different. Yeah,
and I think there's something like the time travel element of it is very sort of interesting and fun for kids.
Yeah, I think especially because like your life is so regimented as like a first grade or second grade or something like that, the idea of you waking up and not knowing where like the authority figures are is like an actual nightmare that I probably would have had.
Let's go to some lecture stuff to get this really kicked off hot. This is Brian J. Jones, an Irving biographer at the New York Society Library. Apparently, Washington Irving himself was a trustee back in the day, as was Herman Melville, who I think we're bigger fans of. And here he is talking a bit about how Irving was sort of thought of, and a bit about Irving the man and sort of his place in literary society.
Even in his own time, people seem to forget that he was an innovator. Edgar Allan Poe once privately admitted that he considered Irving much overrated. Here's what Poe says: "A nice distinction might be drawn between his just and surreptitious and adventitious reputation, between what is due to the pioneer solely and what to the writer. But what skeptics like Poe didn't seem to appreciate is that going first also meant going it alone. Irving had no role models for how one manages an image or a reputation or how one deals with the press. Irving had to fend for himself, and he had to improvise. So with that in mind, then, I want to spend this afternoon looking at how Washington Irving went about improvising his most unique American life."
So this is the second one, literary hangover recording session of this sort of fully geared up iteration. But this Rip Van Winkle and Sleepy Hollow actually preceded The Spy, which we've already recorded in chronology, coming out a bit earlier. And we've commented on before, there's a few different reasons for this sort of lag in literary production, whether it's because, the novel hadn't reached its form yet. But it's interesting that after the War of 1812, there's sort of like a gelling of American nationalism, and then all of a sudden you get this sort of literary output. The other thing that's interesting is, like The Spy, Irving comes from a sort of wealthy background, but it wasn't as wealthy as he had sort of hoped. It's sort of like his sort of patrimonial estate was sort of in decline. So following the War of 1812, so he goes to Europe, and and this is where he eventually produces the sketchbook of Geoffrey Cran, Gentleman.
So even before Irving was famous, he had a knack for finagling invitations to the finest parties. It was a skill he had honed during a 2-year stay in Europe as a young man, a young 20-something. In 1804, he would have been about 20, 21. And he could always manage to show up at someone's house just as the roast chicken was being put on the table. But in 1811, he crashed the ultimate party, a White House social that was hosted by First Lady Dolly Madison. No invitation, no problem. I swore by all my gods I would be there, Irving said, and thus he was. He loved Mrs. Madison. He said of her, Mrs. Madison is a fine, portly, buxom dame who has a smile and a pleasant word for everybody. But compared with his outgoing hostess, unfortunately, first wallflower James Madison didn't compare so well. As to Jemmy Madison, Irving says, ah, poor Jemmy, he is but a withered little apple john. Irving would become a friend and admirer of both the president and the first lady. The president, in fact, was a fan of Irving's. Irving said, the president pronounced me a promising young man, but that I talk too much. And that was probably an understatement. But unfortunately, Irving had to put parties and America behind him in 1815. He left for England, at first just for kind of a change of venue, but he was immediately forced to shoulder the burdens of a family business that was quickly going bankrupt. It was humiliating work, but Irving still found time to travel the countryside widely. He even managed, of course, to secure a letter of invitation to his idol, the romantic poet Walter Scott. Late in 1817, Irving shows up on Scott's doorstep. Scott's castle, this sort of castle home Abbotsford, is still standing. He is welcomed warmly by Sir Walter. Well, I wasn't sorry yet. He is welcomed warmly by Scott. And during those days, he and Scott cemented a friendship that would last until Scott's death 15 years later. And Irving said of Scott, I came prepared to admire him, but he completely won my heart and made me love him. The days thus spent I shall ever look back to as among the very happiest of my life, for I was conscious at the time of being happy. But Sir Walter Scott was a Irving fan and convert. He said, one of the best and pleasantest acquaintances I have made many a day. So Scott, in fact, would play a key role in making Irving's name. Following the failure of the family business, Irving had to remain in England to try his hand at writing. He was working on a series of essays, and in 1819, he began publishing these essays simultaneously in the United States and England. This is the way you protected your copyright. It was actually a brilliant move on Irving's part. He was one of the first to figure out that if you published both in the United States and England, somebody couldn't get a book in the United States, come across the ocean, and publish it without you getting any profit. So Irving nipped that in the bud by printing them in both countries at the same time.
It's funny how much those sorts of considerations determine a lot of this.
Like success?
Not success, but the sort of release of certain stories, like, I don't know, just the economic considerations of, especially early on, how you, like, so the sketchbook isn't the first thing Washington Irving wrote. Let me see what the first thing, I forget what it was actually called.
Well, it seems like both this and Cooper's writing career came off like kind of like at the last minute, or like right before they were successful, like, oh, I should probably be a writer, rather than this like artistic calling that in a post like romanticism world we kind of see the writer artist as, like someone like from birth is like predestined to be a writer. Both these writers seem pushed more by like economic reasons than anything else.
Yeah, and sort of, but like they're educated and then they realize like their real life, like the cynical reading is their real life, they're not going to be able to order it the way they would as like a landed gentleman, so they'll do that in imaginary land. It's so the first thing that Irving wrote, which was also under the Geoffrey Cran pseudonym, was A History of New York, which was published in 1809. The funny thing about that is, to drum up to publicity for that, they printed up these flyers where it said, such and such needs to report back to me, or I'm going to print these stories that he doesn't want me to print publicly.
Right.
And that was really helpful there. This is from Michael Warner in ELH, which I don't know what it stands for, but it's John Hopkins's literary journal. This is actually from fall 2000, and it goes into sort of Washington Irving was a bachelor, never married, and how fiction sort of became that for him. He wasn't able to start a family and continue the patrimonial line, so he became a writer.
In October of 1817, Irving wrote to Henry Brevoort, one of his best friends, about Brevoort's upcoming marriage. I am almost ashamed to say that at first the news had rather the effect of making me feel melancholy than glad. It seemed in a manner to divorce us forever, for marriage is the grave of bachelor's intimacy, and after having lived and grown together for many years, so that our habits, thoughts, and feelings were quite blended and intertwined, a separation of this kind is a serious matter, not so much to you, who are transplanted into the garden of matrimony, to flourish and fructify and be caressed into prosperity, but for poor me, left lonely and forlorn, and blasted by every wind of heaven. This letter's bachelor consciousness about unaffiliated individuals who face the grave, and families who fructify, dominates the sketchbook, which Irving was just beginning to write while living in Birmingham with his sister.
Brevoort, who he was writing that letter to, was one of his really close friends. That was a very wealthy family, and we talked about a little bit about how his publicity stunt for his first book, History of New York. To publicize the sketchbook of Geoffrey Cran, Brevoort, the friend he was talking about, like how sad he was because he's getting married and not going to be a bachelor with him anymore, published in the New York Evening Post 3 days after release an anonymous review of the sketchbook that said it was really great. That really helped the publicity of it. Now, Brevoort, his dad, there's a reason Broadway is crooked, apparently. I found in the research at 10th Street, there's that Grace Church, Mm-hmm. And it stops going so much southeast and sort of goes more southerly. The reason is apparently because Brevoort had orchards. So Washington Irving's friends in high places. Have you heard something different?
Yeah, well, is it not true that I thought for the longest time that Broadway was an old Native American trail, and that's why it breaks off in the grid. But then I've also heard that that's just not true.
Okay, so this is from ephemeralnewyork.wordpress.com. One of the wonderful things about New York is how much of the city veers off the rectangular street grid codified by the Common Council in 1811. The sudden bend on Broadway at East 10th Street is one of those street grid exceptions, and as the story goes, it's a result of a single man intent on preserving his family farm. Huh. Henry Brevoort Sr. was a descendant of the Brevoort family, which settled in New York from Holland in the 17th century. His farm was on the outskirts of the early 19th century city, spanning 86 acres from present-day 9th Street to 18th Street. Damn, that's some good property.
Yeah.
And bounded by Fifth Avenue and the Bowery. In 1815, with New York's population swelling and moving northward, city officials announced plans to expand Broadway to 23rd Street and have it run in a straight line. Straightening Broadway meant that the busy thoroughfare and urbanization it would bring would cut right through Brevoort's estate. He protested and the city relented. Now, it doesn't really have a lot of hard evidence for this. I'm looking right now.
I don't think that the one I've heard is true either. That just seems ridiculous. That there's like one trail and that
BrooklynHistory.org says it. So let's see here. From the Brevoort family paper. So there looks to be at least some documentation here. Anyway, that's Washington Irving's friends in high places, helping them get the placement for the review there.
Well, I like his whole concept of that first book is because I've never read it, but it shows up constantly if you read any like New York history, and I love the idea of like an early New Yorker being self-conscious about the fact that like this is a major city and it needs like a major history, so I'm going to come up with this like Knickerbocker family.
Yeah.
In the meanwhile, like erasing its more complex history of a Dutch outpost and then an English outpost and then its own estate in its own nation, which I do think comes up both in Rip Van Winkle and Sleepy Hollow.
Is that sort of what that Gotham book history? Who's that by? You're a big fan of
Mike
that, right?
Wallace.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's that, and then there's I can't remember his name, but someone just wrote a really concise history of New Amsterdam, the colony, which is really only like 40 years between the the foundation and then Peter Stuyvesant running it, and then it being taken over because it was like, you know, in the heart of the satellite collection of English colonies, and then England was like, well, we'll take that too.
Yeah, I'll have that.
Yeah,
here's
the
a bit.
central port.
Here's a bit more from Irving's Posterity.
For marriage is the grave of bachelor's intimacy, and after having lived and grown together for many years, so that our habits, thoughts, and feelings were quite blended and intertwined, a separation of this kind is a serious matter, not so much to you, who are transplanted into the garden of matrimony, to flourish and fructify and be caressed into prosperity, but for poor me, left lonely and forlorn, and blasted by every wind of heaven. 31. This letter's bachelor consciousness about unaffiliated individuals who face the grave, and families who fructify, dominates the sketchbook, which Irving was just beginning to write while living in Birmingham with his sister, his brother-in-law, and their many children. He was also attempting to rescue the family business from a looming bankruptcy. As a younger son whose independence could no longer be secured by the family, and who had already cited financial worry as his reason for remaining unmarried, he seems to have registered the vicissitudes of capital through a confused mixture of class shame, troubled masculinity, socio sexual isolation, and fear of mortality. This was vile, he wrote, and sordid and humiliated me to the dust. I underwent ruin in all its bitterness and humiliation in a strange land among strangers.
It's interesting, like, how that's sort of like you're falling from a place in society that you imagine you should be at, so it just completely messes you up. I haven't seen any huge suggestion, we'll get to it a little bit more, I think, in this, that Irving was gay, like that sort of confirmed bachelor euphemism. So that I guess let's just play a little bit more of this.
This was vile, he wrote, and sordid and humiliated me to the dust. I underwent ruin in all its bitterness and humiliation in a strange land among strangers. Irving made this confession in the same small notebook that contained jottings for the sketchbook, and which he later titled Notes While Preparing Sketchbook. In it he goes on to say, how the truth presses home upon us as we advance in life, that everything around us is transient and uncertain. It is one of those common truths that sleep in our ears, never heeded until we feel it withering at our hearts, until it is told in the funeral of our friends and written on the wrecks of our hopes and affections. The echoes of this sentiment can be heard throughout the sketchbook, not least in Rip Van Winkle, where the truth that all is transient at last ceases to sleep in our ears. Just after the volume was published, Irving returned to the crisis of bachelorhood in another letter to a literary friend, this time James Kirk Halding. Your picture of domestic enjoyment indeed raises my envy. With all my wandering habits, which are the result of circumstances rather than of disposition, I think I was formed for an honest, domestic, uxorious man, and I cannot hear of my old cronies snugly nestled down with good wives and fine children round them, but I feel for the moment desolate and forlorn. Heavens, what a haphazard, schemeless life mine has been, that here I should be, at this time of life, youth slipping away, and scribbling month after month and year after year, far from home, without any means or prospect of entering into matrimony, which I absolutely believe indispensable to the happiness and even comfort of the after part of existence. When I fell into misfortunes and saw all the means of domestic establishment pass away like a dream, I used to comfort myself with the idea that if I was indeed doomed to remain single, you and Brevard and Goove Campbell would also do the same, and that we should form a knot of queer, rum old bachelors, at some future day to meet at the corner of Wall Street or walk the sunny side of Broadway and kill time together.
Based on these two stories that we read, particularly in Rip Van Winkle, I think the writer has very little respect for domesticity in any serious way.
Right, yeah.
It's like both, it's because it seems like it's like just a typical hatred of women, but it kind of like bleeds over into the concept of marriage almost entirely, that it only hinders a free spirit or someone who wants to like just live his life, and it's such a pain in the ass to be married that like, I mean, I know it's only a short story, but there's like zero redeeming qualities in his domestic life.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, let's actually get to playing some of the actual story, because it's amazing how much that just is the story. Like, Rip gets hounded by his wife to basically need to escape to the woods, where he bowls 9-pin. I mean, it's funny how much it is just bowling. I tried to look up.
Yeah.
Like,
with ghosts.
Like, he goes bowling with some like weird creatures. The description of which are actually, I thought, unsettling. We'll play it. Here's the description of Rip Van Winkle. This is from a collection on Audible of short stories, The American Experience. Here's the introduction of Rip Van Winkle himself.
There lived many years since, while the country was yet a province of Great Britain, a simple, good-natured fellow of the name of Rip Van Winkle. He was a descendant of the Van Winkles who figured so gallantly in the chivalrous days of Peter Stuyvesant, and accompanied him on the siege of Fort Christina. He inherited, however, but little of the martial character of his ancestors. I have observed that he was a simple, good-natured man. He was, moreover, a kind neighbor, and an obedient, hen-pecked husband. Indeed, to the latter circumstance might be owing that meekness of spirit which gained him such universal popularity. For those men are most apt to be obsequious and conciliating abroad who are under the discipline of shrews at home. Their tempers, doubtless, are rendered pliant and malleable in the fiery furnace of domestic tribulation, and a curtain lecture is worth all the sermons in the world for teaching the virtues of patience and long-suffering. A termagant wife may therefore in some respects be considered a tolerable blessing, and if so, Rip Van Winkle was thrice blessed. Certain it is that he was a great favorite among all the good wives of the village, who, as usual with the amiable sex, took his part in all family squabbles, and never failed, whenever they talked those matters over in their evening gossipings, to lay all the blame on Dame Van Winkle.
See, even the other women are anti-Dame Van Winkle, which is interesting.
Yeah, it's like backup proof to be like that no one liked her. Okay.
Which is a very, like, that seems like old-fashioned comedy, like, take my wife, no, seriously, sort of thing, right?
It's almost like this story in particular reminded me a lot of, like, you could place it in, like, the Canterbury Tales, although I think the characters are slightly flatter than Chaucer's. But this idea of, like, this, like, lost trope in English literature, which is, like, this is what my wife is up to now, that crazy bitch.
Yeah.
I think this is trying to play on that tradition a little bit, but mainly just kind of coming off as, like, pretty harsh, or just kind of like, you don't even, I guess it makes sense. So you don't, like, see her interior, but you only see her show up once or twice, and she's like, God damn it.
The interesting thing from a, like, American history standpoint is she's the one that's trying to get him to be industrious.
Yeah.
She tries to get him to do his work, and he, like, wants to basically like fuck around with the, like, village kids and help his neighbors, like, do stuff, like, need any help. Like, it's a weird impulse, and I don't really know what Irving's getting at by his characterization of Rip as, like, always quick to help other people, but sort of fatalistic in his own industriousness. Like, he talks about how Rip's farm, no matter what he does, he just can't get ahead on it.
Yeah, there's definitely, like, a quality that he's, like, a fool, right? But it's not totally sketched out. You know, like a Don Quixote almost, but, you know, Don Quixote is complex and he, like, speaks truth and doesn't know it or something, or like a Falstaff who's, like, wise and veils it in humor. This one's just kind of like an idiot who means well.
Yeah.
And that's about it.
And one of the things I think with this story and in Sleepy Hollow, interesting with Irving, is I think he sort of talks to two different audiences, like one that believes the bullshit, like, fairy tale elements of it.
Yes.
Like, that could believe that Rip's farm is just unlucky, and then there's a more knowing audience that sees it as, oh, Rip's just probably, like, incompetent.
Yeah.
And this similar thing sort of happens in Sleepy Hollow. Like, let's go a bit more into this.
The children of the village, too, would shout with joy whenever he approached. He assisted at their sports, made their playthings, taught them to fly kites and shoot marbles, and told them long stories of ghosts, witches, and Indians. Whenever he went dodging about the village, he was surrounded by a troop of them, hanging on his skirts, clambering on his back, and playing 1,000 tricks on him with impunity, and not a dog would bark at him throughout the neighborhood. The great error in Rip's composition was an insuperable aversion to all kinds of profitable labor. It could not be from the want of assiduity or perseverance, for he would sit on a wet rock with a rod as long and heavy as a Tartar's lance and fish all day without a murmur, even though he should not be encouraged by a single nibble.
Yeah, so, like, that sort of thing.
I guess there's something to, like, it could be like window dressing for, like, this is what a like a colonial America would have been like, which is just kind of this, like, prelapsarian, very relaxed, beautiful world where even this, like, idiot can get by, essentially. That it's not as intense or as quick-paced as the post-revolutionary world, which we can get into after he wakes up. But I think there's, like, a stark contrast to be made between those two worlds.
Yeah, there definitely is. Like, it talks about how everyone seems a bit more like busy, I guess would be the word. The one through line I think that's sort of interesting, and we'll get to it here, is the inn/hotel. It's an inn at first before he goes to sleep, and then it's a hotel afterwards. Has a picture of King George on it before, and it's George Washington afterwards. Here's where sort of Rip likes to go to escape, and it's sort of interesting that it's a social escape in a sort of coffee house style atmosphere.
Well, also like the second most important part of his life. Like when he wakes up, he's like, his home is destroyed. He's like, well, where should I go? And the next thing is the tavern, which is like, that would basically be like the second most important focal point in his community.
Times grew worse and worse with Rip Van Winkle as years of matrimony rolled on. A tart temper never mellows with age, and a sharp tongue is the only edged tool that grows keener with constant use. For a long while he used to console himself when driven from home by frequenting a kind of perpetual club of the sages, philosophers, and other idle personages of the village, which held its sessions on a bench before a small inn, designated by a rubicund portrait of His Majesty George III. Here they used to sit in the shade through a long, lazy summer's day, talking listlessly over village gossip, or telling endless, sleepy stories about nothing. But it would have been worth any statesman's money to have heard the profound discussions that sometimes took place when by chance an old newspaper fell into their hands from some passing traveler. How solemnly they would listen to the contents as drawled out by Derek Van Bummel, the schoolmaster, a dapper, learned little man who was not to be daunted by the most gigantic word in the dictionary, and how sagely they would deliberate upon public events some months after they had taken place.
Bit of an elitist satire there.
Yeah.
Look at the people getting their old news and talking about it after all the decisions have been done.
But it's like, there's like satire there, but it's kind of aimless because it's not like Rip Van Winkle is the paragon of like common sense. I feel like in this story, that's why it's hard for someone to grasp onto, because it's like, there's never a good contrast. It's just everyone is kind of flailing.
Yeah. It is because he's like he's like slightly just poking at, but it does, I do think there is the two registers there, like the elitist versus populist thing. There's another point where he's talking about like the pescatory tactics from England not working in the Hudson or whatever. And it's sort of like using that terminology. It's like, which side are you making fun of? Like,
it's like an aimless kind of satire, which is like, I know you're jabbing at someone, but it's always not clear who the recipient is.
Yeah, it's almost just like pointing at the intersection of those two things is the joke itself.
Yeah.
So basically, Rip continues to hate his life because his wife, is just such a bitch. But he has kids who don't play much of a role that I can see in the first half.
Yeah, not in the first part.
But anyway, he goes out with his dog Wolf, I believe his name, and his gun. The firearm. That's one thing I'm going to sort of log as we read these books, is what's the place of firearms in all of them, and we're 2 for 2. Obviously, the spy has lots of guns, but and Harvey Birch and that sort of thing. But also the firearm here. There's a funny part where after Rip comes back and everyone thinks he's crazy. They're like, one guy is like, I need to go get the communal gun in case we need to put this guy down. Here is Rip, though, when he sort of escapes his wife into the woods for sort of one final time.
I like how she hints at, there seems to be some sort of history with him, like, getting lost in the woods, because she's like, for the love of God, like, just go get what we need to get and come back. And he's like, yeah, all right, whatever.
Wolf bristled up his back and, giving a low growl, skulked to his master's side, looking fearfully down into the glen. Rip now felt a vague apprehension stealing over him. He looked anxiously in the same direction and perceived a strange figure slowly toiling up the rocks and bending under the weight of something he carried on his back. He was surprised to see any human being in this lonely and unfrequented place, but supposing it to be someone of the neighborhood in need of his assistance, he hastened down to yield it.
So helpful.
On nearer approach, he was still more surprised at the singularity of the stranger's appearance. He was a short, square-built old fellow with thick, bushy hair and a grizzled beard. His dress was of the antique Dutch fashion, a cloth jerkin strapped around the waist, several pair of breeches, the outer one of ample volume, decorated with rows of buttons down the sides and bunches at the knees. He bore on his shoulders a stout keg that seemed full of liquor, and made signs for Rip to approach and assist him with the load. Though rather shy and distrustful of this new acquaintance, Rip complied with his usual alacrity, and mutually relieving one another, they clambered up a narrow gully, apparently the dry bed of a mountain torrent. As they ascended, Rip every now and then heard long rolling peals like distant thunder that seemed to issue out of a deep ravine, or rather cleft between lofty rocks, toward which their rugged path conducted. He paused for an instant, but supposing it to be the muttering of one of those transient thunder showers which often take place in the mountain heights, he proceeded. Passing through the ravine, they came to a hollow like a small amphitheater, surrounded by perpendicular precipices, over the brinks of which impending trees shot their branches, so that you only caught glimpses of the azure sky and the bright evening cloud. During the whole time, Rip and his companion had labored on in silence, for though the former marveled greatly what could be the object of carrying a keg of liquor up this wild mountain, yet there was something strange and incomprehensible about the unknown that inspired awe and checked familiarity. On entering the amphitheater, new objects of wonder presented themselves. On a level spot in the center was a company of odd-looking personages playing at ninepins.
Now, this part is actually, I think, creepy, like the way he describes this. You can tell it does seem sort of dreamlike.
Yeah.
Like this whole story seems like something you came up with in a dream, or took from a German folktale.
They were dressed in a quaint, outlandish fashion. Some wore short doublets, others jerkins with long knives in their belts, and most of them had enormous breeches of similar style to that of the guides. Their visages, too, were peculiar. One had a large beard, broad face, and small piggish eyes. The face of another seemed to consist entirely of nose, and he was surmounted by a white sugarloaf hat set off with a little red cock's tail. They all had beards of various shapes and colors. There was one who seemed to be the commander. He was a stout old gentleman, with a weather-beaten countenance. He wore a lanced doublet, broad belt and hanger, high-crowned hat and feather, red stockings, and high-heeled shoes with roses in them. The whole group reminded Rip of the figures in an old Flemish painting in the parlor of Dami van Schaik, the village parson, and which had been brought over from Holland at the time of the settlement. What seemed particularly odd to Rip was that, though these folks were evidently amusing themselves, yet they maintained the gravest faces, the most mysterious silence, and were withal the most melancholy party of pleasure he had ever witnessed. Nothing interrupted the stillness of the scene but the noise of the balls, which, whenever they rolled, echoed along the mountains like rumbling peals of thunder.
There's also something really good about that rolling peals of thunder thing, because it's as a sort of legend creator, because then kids during thunderstorms think, oh, maybe that's the crazy, like, imps or whatever you'd call these things.
Well, that's what got me curious about this story in particular. When this is published, is it meant for children? Or is that like imposing too much like a modern...
Yeah, definitely. I don't think it was. I think it was maybe meant for like younger... I think books, literature maybe aimed towards younger women at that time, but definitely not like... I don't think children's literature. Although maybe folktales were a bit like that. This one was actually based on Peter Klaus. This is from Wikipedia. I have read it. It's very short. The story follows a German goat herd from a fictional village named Sittendorf. While looking for escaped goats, Peter Klaus is led to where others are playing games in the woods. After tasting their wine, he falls asleep and wakes up 20 years later. Irving was dogged by accusations of plagiarism that really pissed him off a lot. Because he does, if you read the actual prefaces, they're fictional and they say it's all true, but they also nod at it being from a German story.
Yeah.
But like they kept doing this like gotchas, like, oh, this is exactly like this German folktale, and he's like, yeah, I know, that's where I got it. But to be fair, like, that folktale doesn't have the thing of like sleeping through a revolution or the escaping your wife. Like, this what makes it sort of an interesting story.
Well, I think there's a level of ironic detachment that's unique to this compared to all the other folktales that this comes from, where like the immediate reason for this folktale is like to create an aura or a feeling around this story, whereas like I feel like the Rip Van Winkle one, it's like keeps winking at the audience, like we know that this is like a folktale, but there's like a real world realness to it, I guess. It's like he's escaping his fucking wife. But almost. That's like, wouldn't this be funny? Or I guess there's like some sort of like ironic humor to like, wouldn't it be hilarious if you were able to get away from your annoying, boring life and ran into this?
Right. And it's amazing to me, just the bowling element of it. Like, that seems like to nail America. Like, bowling might not be what it once was. Like, I don't know if it, but like, when did bowling peak? Like in the 80s? Like relatively recently, right?
Yeah, I think so. That photo of Nixon is probably the peak of bowling in popular culture.
Like, so as men escaping their wives to play a dumb thing where they roll a ball. Yeah. Like,
well, and also more important, or interestingly, I think it's Rip Van Winkle's ability to say yes to like everyday occurrences in life, right? Like any kid who needs help, he doesn't have the same value set that you're supposed to as an adult. That's why he's able to find these ghosts, right? Because he's like there's a sound and I'm gonna go find it.
I'm gonna help that guy lug that beer up that mountain.
Yeah. It's like, whereas I think his wife is supposed to be in stark contrast to someone who's like immediately focused on the material world around her. So she would never even see this if she could, if it was even given to her as an opportunity.
So Rip basically bowls with the very stoic, creepy dwarves. I don't know what we're calling these things, but the weird looking things, and drinks their alcohol and gets fucked up. And
what is it called? It's some specific drink with like a pea or something. I can't remember.
Let's see. They might get into it here.
By degrees, Rip's awe and apprehension subsided. He even ventured, when no eye was fixed upon him, to taste the beverage which he found had much of the flavor of excellent Hollands. He was naturally a thirsty soul, and was soon tempted to the repeat of the draught. One taste provoked another, and he reiterated his visits to the flagon so often that at length his senses were overpowered. His eyes swam in his head gradually declined, and he fell into a deep sleep. On waking, he found himself on the green knoll whence he had first seen the old man of the glen. He rubbed his eyes. It was a bright, sunny morning. The birds were hopping and twittering among the bushes, and the eagle was wheeling aloft and breasting the pure mountain breeze. Surely, thought Rip, I have not slept here all night. He recalled the occurrences before he fell asleep. The strange man with a keg of liquor, the mountain ravine, the wild retreat among the rocks, the woebegone party at Ninepins, the flagon. Oh, that flagon, that wicked flagon, thought Rip. What excuse shall I make to Dame Van Winkle?
The other thing this reminds me of is UFOs as an excuse guys give their wives for the reason they've like been on a bender for like a week.
Well, there is that Ricky Gervais episode. I assume you know that, where it's like, where he walks into the house and he's like, this crazy thing happened. And the wife's like, don't worry about that. What's up with or where have you been for 3 days?
Yeah.
Right, there's this fellow, I think it happened in America, and he saw a bright light in the sky. And
Carl, if you're bored.
And he stood there.
This is a true story, is it?
Yeah. He stood there.
Yes, of course it isn't, Steve.
And he saw this bright light, and it came closer and closer, and it was a UFO, right?
Yep.
And he looked at it, and it disappeared, right? And he gets back in his car.
He looks in the mirror.
And he looks in the mirror.
Yep.
He's only got a beard.
He has. Are you sure it wasn't someone else who got in the car, and he was still standing out there?
No, right.
What?
And it turned out, he got home and said to his wife or his girlfriend, it's a bit weird. So I just got out of the car to look at a bright light, and I got back in the car and grew a beard, and she said, never mind your beard, where have you been for 3 days?
He's trying to that's like hard proof that UFOs exist.
Right. That actually, it would make me believe in UFOs a lot more if this story was about Rip getting beamed up and by some machine. But
oh, I see.
Unfortunately,
and this is a true story that
no, I just mean if the imagination, if UFOs were a true thing, people say they see a UFO in the Mona Lisa or whatever, but it's not really fucking there. There's no UFOs in that shit.
Do people say that?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, if you watch enough a UFO shit, it's like, look at this ancient evidence of UFOs and that sort of stuff, and it's never. It's like, okay, there's like basic sauce thing. Cavemen drew a lot of shit. You can interpret it however you want. Is all I'm saying. But yeah, that flagon, I got fucked up, and I gotta go report to my wife.
I thought that there was. When did they reference that it was the crew of the Half Moon, Henry Hudson's?
I think that's at the end actually. But
it's weird that detail is left until much later.
Take the opinion of old Peter Vanderdunk, who was seen slowly advancing up the road. He was a descendant of the historian of that name, who wrote one of the earliest accounts of the province. Peter was the most ancient inhabitant of the village, and well versed in all the wonderful events and traditions of the neighborhood. He recollected Rip at once and corroborated his story in the most satisfactory manner. He assured the company that it was a fact handed down from his ancestor, the historian, that the Catskill Mountains had always been haunted by strange beings, that it was affirmed that the great Hendrik Hudson, the first discoverer of the river and country, kept a kind of vigil there every 20 years with his crew of the Half Moon, being permitted in this way to revisit the scenes of his enterprise and keep a guardian eye upon the river and the great city called by his name. That his father had once seen them in their old Dutch dresses playing at ninepins in a hollow in the mountain, and that he himself had heard one summer afternoon the sound of their balls like distant peals of thunder.
Now here is where he sort of returns and sees the hotel.
Fine cut indeed. My very dog, sighed poor Rip, has forgotten me. He entered the house, which, to tell the truth, Dame Van Winkle had always kept in neat order. It was empty, forlorn, and apparently abandoned. This desolateness overcame all his connubial fears. He called loudly for his wife and children. The lonely chambers rang for a moment with his voice, and then all again was silence. He now hurried forth and hastened to his old resort, the village inn, but it too was gone. A large rickety wooden building stood in its place, with great gaping windows, some of them broken and mended with old hats and petticoats, and over the door was painted, "The Union Hotel" by Jonathan Doolittle. Instead of the great tree that used to shelter the quiet little Dutch inn of yore, there now was reared a tall, naked pole with something on top that looked like a red nightcap, and from it was fluttering a flag, on which was a singular assemblage of stars and stripes. All this was strange and incomprehensible. He recognized on the sign, however, the ruby face of King George, under which he had smoked so many a peaceful pipe, but even this was singularly metamorphosed. The red coat was changed for one of blue and buff. A sword was held in the hand instead of a scepter, the head was decorated with a cocked hat, and underneath was painted in large characters, General Washington.
The other thing about this is I feel like it's a good thing I think this captures is a sort of American habit of sleeping through actual history. Like, we're one of the more interesting countries. I mean, this is not to be American exceptionalist, but just indulge me for a second. Like the revolutionary history of America was noted like hugely by like intelligentsia types and political types across the world. However, there's a huge chunk of the population for which, you know, they're not really involved in what it actually means on that level.
Yeah, like on a personal perspective, that's interesting. And I also think if you like a colonial identity perspective, New York is largely absent from any kind of revolutionary activity. It's immediately captured by the British in the Battle of Brooklyn and essentially sits out the rest of the war until the Battle of Yorktown when it's freed later on. So especially like the idea of him meeting these like possible Dutch sailors and then going to this like lost past of New York and then waking up and the war's over is essentially like a nice analogy for how New York, the colony, existed during the Revolutionary War.
Where's Van Bummel, the schoolmaster? He went off to the wars too.
This is where Rip is basically talking about where is everybody I used to know, and he's finding out that a lot of them are dead. You'll notice he doesn't reveal who he is until after he confirms the death of someone.
There was, as usual, a crowd of folk about the door, but none that Rip recollected. The very character of the people seemed changed. There was a busy, bustling, disputatious tone about it, instead of the accustomed phlegm and drowsy tranquillity. He looked in vain for the sage Nicholas Vedder, with his broad-faced double chin and fair long pipe, uttering clouds of tobacco smoke instead of idle speeches. Or
there's that bit about the change in the people from a phlegmatic to a more bustling.
That's my favorite part, or that's the most intriguing part for me, because I love, it's a little bit later on, but like the first way to identify Rip Van Winkle for this new quick-paced age is, okay, are you a Federalist or are you a Democrat? Mm-hmm. All of a sudden it's like your political identity is so part of you that it's like that's the best way to identify someone,
right?
And then to say you're like what is he like?
A loyal subject of King George.
Loyal subject to the King George, which in no way previously did that ever define him. It was just this kind of like, well, I guess
throwaway,
yeah, like this bullshit thing to say. But all of a sudden, politics is extremely important and maybe the central aspect of your life. And it's just it's the same day as an election, isn't that right?
Oh yeah, is that what the hat on the pole signifies?
Mm-hmm.
Van Bummel, the schoolmaster, doling forth the contents of an ancient newspaper. In place of these, a lean, bilious-looking man with his pockets full of handbills was haranguing vehemently about rights of citizens, elections, members of Congress, liberty, Bunker's Hills, heroes of '76, and other words which were a perfect Babylonish jargon to the bewildered Van Winkle. The appearance of Rip with his long grizzled beard, his rusty fowling piece, his uncouth dress, and an army of women and children at his heels soon attracted the attention of the tavern politicians. They crowded round him, eyeing him from head to foot with great curiosity. The orator bustled up to him and, drawing him partly aside, inquired on which side he voted. Rip stared in vacant stupidity. Another short but busy little fellow pulled him by the arm and, rising on tiptoe, inquired in his ear whether he was Federal or Democrat. Rip was equally at a loss to comprehend the question, when a knowing, self-important old gentleman in a sharp-cocked hat made his way through the crowd, putting them to the right and left with his elbows as he passed, and planting himself before Van Winkle, with one arm akimbo and the other resting on his cane, his keen eyes and sharp hat penetrating as it were into his very soul, demanded in an austere tone what brought him to the election with a gun on his shoulder and a mob at his heels, and whether he meant to breed a riot in the village. "Alas, gentlemen," cried Rip, somewhat dismayed, "I am a poor quiet man, a native of the place, and a loyal subject of the king, God bless him." Here a general shout burst from the bystanders. A Tory, a spy, a refugee! Hustle him away, away with him! It was with great difficulty that the self-important man in a cocked hat restored order, and having assumed a tenfold austerity of brow, demanded again of the unknown culprit what he came there for and whom he was seeking.
We're going to skip a bit forward here where Rip starts asking where all of his friends are, and you can tell that sort of diffuses the crowd's unease with him because they can see that he's actually referencing real people that they know that are just actually dead.
"Where's Bram Dutcher?" "Oh, he went off to the army in the beginning of the war. Some say he was killed at the storming of Stony Point. Others say he was drowned in a squall at the foot of Anthony's Nose. I don't know. He never came back again." "Where's Van Bummel, the schoolmaster?" "He went off to the wars too, was a great militia general, and is now in Congress." Rip's heart died away at hearing of these sad changes in his home and friends, and finding himself thus alone in the world. Every answer puzzled him, too, by treating of such enormous lapses of time, and of matters which he could not understand. War, Congress, Stony Point. He had no courage to ask after any more friends, but cried out in despair, "Does nobody here know Rip Van Winkle?" "Oh, Rip Van Winkle!" exclaimed two or three. "Oh, to be sure, that's Rip Van Winkle yonder, leaning against the tree." Rip looked, and he beheld a precise counterpart of himself as he went up to the mountains, apparently as lazy and certainly as ragged. The poor fellow was now completely confounded. He doubted his own identity and whether he was himself or another man. In the midst of his bewilderment, the man in the cocked hat demanded who he was and what was his name. "God knows," exclaimed he at his wit's end. "I'm not myself, I'm somebody else. That's me yonder. No, that's somebody else got in my shoes. I was myself last night, but I fell asleep on the mountain, and they've changed my gun, and everything's changed, and then I'm changed, and I can't tell what's my name or who I am." The bystanders began now to look at each other, nod, wink significantly, and tap their fingers against their foreheads. There was a whisper also about securing the gun and keeping the old fellow from doing mischief, at the very suggestion of which the self-important man in the cocked hat retired with some precipitation.
I liked it as like a reader, even though I know, he's been asleep. But you're ratcheting up the tension as a writer, right? Like it's unclear, even though I guess it's pretty clear. He wakes up with a beard and his gun is like rotted away. It's like you've been asleep for a long time. Mm-hmm. But that detail is not firmly established yet. So it keeps getting weirder and weirder and weirder. And then like to no one recognizing you, I feel like the one step beyond that would be, well, there's you right over there. Like this level of uncanny, right, which would be truly disturbing. And it's the only, I don't know, I don't connect too much to like the ghost stuff, but the idea of like waking up and no one recognizing you and then being, oh, your name? He's over there. And then it's your spinning image would be pretty horrific.
As to Rip's son and heir, who was the ditto of himself seen leaning against the tree, he was employed to work on the farm, but evinced a hereditary disposition to attend to anything else but his business.
This did remind me of a point when I was reading. I love the idea, for some reason, that Irving wanted to point out that Rip Van Winkle's friends either dying or now being in Congress were equally horrific. In like Rip Van Winkle's mind, where it's like, your friend, he's dead. Your other friend, he's in Congress. And he goes, tell me no more. I don't want to hear it.
This is his daughter returns to what we find out to be his daughter comes and recognizes him eventually.
Began now to look at each other, nod, wink significantly, and tap their fingers against their foreheads. There was a whisper also about securing the gun and keeping the old fellow from doing mischief, at the very suggestion of which the self-important man in the cocked hat retired with some precipitation. At this critical moment, a fresh, comely woman pressed through the throng to get a peep at the gray-bearded man. She had a chubby child in her arms, which, frightened at his looks, began to cry. "Hush, Rip," cried she. "Hush, you little fool. The old man won't hurt you." The name of the child, the air of the mother, the tone of her voice, all awakened a train of recollections in his mind. "What is your name, my good woman?" asked he. "Judith Gardenier." "And your father's name?" "Ah, poor man, Rip Van Winkle was his name, but it's 20 years since he went away from home with his gun, and never has been heard of since. His dog came home without him, but whether he shot himself or was carried away by the Indians, nobody can tell. I was then but a little girl." Rip had but one question more to ask, and he put it with a faltering voice. "Where's your mother?" "Oh, she too had died but a short time since. She broke a blood vessel in a fit of passion at a New England peddler." There was a drop of comfort, at least in this intelligence. The honest man could contain himself no longer. He caught his daughter and her child in his arms. "I am your father," cried he. "Young Rip Van Winkle, once old Rip Van Winkle now. Does nobody know poor Rip Van Winkle?" All stood amazed, until an old woman, tottering out from among the crowd, put her hand to her brow, and peering under it in his face for a long moment, exclaimed, "Sure enough it is Rip Van Winkle. It is himself. Welcome home again, old neighbor. Why, where have you been these 20 long years?" Rip's story was soon told, for the whole 20 years it had been to him but one night. The neighbors stared when they heard it. Some were seen to wink at each other and put their tongues in their cheeks, and the self-important man in the cocked hat, who, when the alarm was over, had returned to the field, screwed down the corners of his mouth and shook his head, upon which there was a general shaking of the head throughout the assemblage.
You notice that he didn't say who he was until he confirmed the mother was dead.
Yeah.
And he's just happy about it.
Well, it's almost like the story, that's the climax of the story almost. That's like, well, what's the point of having him go to sleep for 20 years and waking up, other than it's like, oh, it's so crazy that he missed a revolution. What's the story? What's for this hero? What's he gaining out of this, or losing? And it turns out he's gaining the fact that his annoying ass wife is dead. Yeah. Which is awesome. It's a story just being like, yeah, his wife was always annoying, and he was lucky enough to just wait her out and she dies in the most embarrassing way, which is nagging, essentially.
Nagging a shopkeeper, like a commercial death. Yeah. Like customer service, death by customer service, basically. Which is, there are some good touches of Irving. Like, I think he does actually have some, I mean, I think he's we'll play a little bit on his politics, maybe to close out this Rip Van Winkle episode. But there's some generally interesting touches when you think of how American history developed after that. Like, you have the guy who is willing to just help out his friends and eventually has, like, mysteries. He falls asleep. The country has a revolution. He wakes up. His wife's dead. Because she was too, like, sort of industrious and too sort of commercial. It eventually kills her.
Yeah, that's interesting. You see glimpses, at least when I was reading it, I saw glimpses of like what frontier literature would be like 50 years later, which is this idea where it's like, this is an area at the end of the world where it's inviting all kinds of people. Some people are very industrious. Some people are like fucking morons who can't hack it in an established place. And I feel like Irving is setting out a claim that like this colonial world is a place that has invited all kinds of people that don't necessarily mesh well together. And this is just one of those stories.
Yeah, and actually we'll talk a little bit more about that in Sleepy Hollow. It specifically mentions migration.
Mm-hmm. Now I'm just imagining like a conservative Rip Van Winkle where they like go to sleep in 1963 and they wake up in like 1968 and they're like, the civil rights bill? What's happened?
It sort of prompts you to do that, like slave owners or someone from like the Civil War.
Or like the liberal version would be like going to sleep and like when Obama's president and then waking up and being like, Trump.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, this is from Washington Irving and the Conservative Imagination. Alan Guttmann is the author, American Literature, May 1964.
Henry S. Canby characterized Washington Irving as the arch-federalist of American literature. L. Henry A. Pockman, repeating Canby's phrase, agreed that Irving was more federalist than the Federalists. 2. Stanley T. Williams' two-volume Life of Washington Irving, 1935, provided much information on young Irving's predominantly Federalist environment and much evidence to substantiate earlier judgments of the anti-Jeffersonian satire in Salmagundi and the Knickerbocker's history. More recent opinion, concentrated on the mythic and folkloric aspects of Irving, has contributed little to a reassessment of Irving's politics. No one has taken up Williams' hint that Irving was made of the very stuff of Tories. The fact is that Irving's federalism was always flawed to milieu. The egalitarianism of Jefferson was fair game for Dietrich Knickerbocker, but Irving's Bursilma was also a ruthless hunter of the stolid bourgeoisie of mercantile New Amsterdam, and the bourgeoisie was very much at home within the Federalist Party. Hamilton believed in strong government to check the democratic impulses of the people, but even Hamilton was in his economic policies an agent of change, the prophet of the transformation of property into the stocks, bonds, and certificates of the modern corporation. Hamilton, Adams, and the literati of Boston's monthly anthology might have snorted at Jeffersonian tendencies, but they themselves were far closer intellectually to Jefferson than to Edmund Burke and the tradition of English conservatism. If Irving lost interest in the quarrels of Hamilton and Jefferson, it was at least in part because he discovered an aristocratic society based on continuity rather than on one classic Americans. In England and Scotland, Irving found what America lacked even under the Federalist administrations of Washington and Adams, a conservative society with a sense of the past. Writing to Sir Walter Scott shortly after his famous visit to Abbotsford, Irving revealed the sources of his political commitments. Although convinced that republicanism was the best form of government for my own country, yet I feel my poetical associations vividly aroused by the old institutions of this country, and should feel as sorry to see them injuried or subverted as I would be to see Windsor Castle or Westminster Abbey demolished to make way for brick tenements.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's sort of his politics, I guess, there. It's interesting.
But he was like pretty ingratiated with the Madison family?
I guess he was a social climber, at least.
I mean, I guess that there would be... It's just surprising that like someone who's out Federalist, the Federalists, would be so close with someone like, you know, Jefferson's protege.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that might have been a bit of an exaggeration.
Right. Was that a quote from him about Westminster Abbey?
Yeah, about how he doesn't want to see doesn't want to see the American institutions fall.
He's quite the evocative quote for like a conservative worldview, or not a modern conservative worldview, but like the William F. Buckleys of the world. Like if they had to describe it in any kind of poetic way, or Edmund Burke, you wouldn't want to demolish Westminster Abbey for tenement housing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I mean, absurd, but a stab at poetics.
Yeah. You don't think Buckley would say something like that?
I don't think he would have the ability to say something like that, but I feel like it's like a poetic encapsulation of their worldview.
Yeah, it's funny because I don't find a whole lot of I'm trying to think of like evidence in Rip Van Winkle. Like,
no, Rip Van Winkle is a complete nonconformist. He shirks all duty and is like celebrated for that. It's not like without ideology, but he shirks any kind of communal responsibility. So it makes it really hard. I think it makes this story pretty hard to put in any kind of political paradigm.
Or he not communal, because he's helpful communally, but like profits wise. Like like if you're not working for yourself, you might as well be asleep or something like that. Because he's willing to help out anybody.
Yeah, that's true. But his escapades remove him from society for at least 2 decades. Mm. And he comes back and it's interesting, I guess, because his like family farm is in ruins, but there could be a reading where you could blame that on his wife because she was so high strung that she had a embolism and died.
Right. Yeah. I don't think there is a lot of evidence. I'm surprised. One thing I am surprised about is the lack of I imagine Big Lebowski. Like I don't remember any Big Lebowski Rip Van Winkle nods. But like this sort of, I don't know, like it strikes me there might be some parallels there. Like, I mean, obviously the bowling thing.
That is interesting.
I mean, he's not married in Big Lebowski.
I think this story,
Right.
like, this story, like, hems very close to the idiot that speaks truth, but that never happens. He never has any kind of insight, even in his own, like, even in the construct of the story. It's just this thing where it's weird because it's a short story where all the activity is happening to him. He's not positing anything. The only way of closure or like a denouement is like that he's very happy that his wife is no longer around.
Yeah, the funny thing is how he doesn't change, because it mentions when he sees his house how he's like, he calls out for his wife, his children and his wife, and so you think, okay, maybe he's had some realization about his wife.
Yeah.
And then later on, it's like, nope, he's actually he's like willing to. He doesn't tell his daughter who he is. Like, the implication being, if she says, "Oh, she's just down at the market," she's
he
gonna
could
be
leave.
here. He could just get the fuck out of here. Like, oh well, I'm. Also, the other, just before we wrap up, because we're gonna do Sleepy Hollow next. Brahm, as a abbreviation for Abraham, appears in this, and also Brom Van Brunt in Sleepy Hollow. I didn't know that was the actual Abraham.
Yeah.
It sounds way cooler than Abraham.
Yeah, Brahm is pretty sick.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's like some hint at like archetypal status in the way that maybe like the Abraham story is. That it's like an archetypal American story, but I can never grasp it. It's always, it's like, it seems like one, or it has like the aesthetic of like almost like a Homeric kind of parable, when you try to grasp on like what it could be, it like slips right through my fingers, where it's like, this just sounds like a fantasy of like someone who doesn't want to be married.
Yeah, it sounds like sort of a dreamlike sort of expression. Like if you were really upset about, like, if you were like really wanted to divorce your wife.
Except for he's not even married in real life. He's just like imagining what it would be like to be married, and then like he's like, I can't even. Oh God.
Wait, who's not married?
Irving.
Oh, right. Yeah, exactly. That's the other weird thing about this.
It's like him trying to, maybe he was like writing it like for a few pages, like, I can't fucking do it, and then just like has him go to sleep for 20 years.
It's like, yeah, I'm gonna write this story about how awful marriage is, while I tell all of my friends how much I wish I was married, but I'm never going to get married, despite. Did we play that part? This is again from Irving's Posterity. That I referenced earlier about Irving's bachelorhood.
I used to comfort myself with the idea that if I was indeed doomed to remain single, you and Brevard and Goove Campbell would also do the same, and that we should form a knot of queer, rum old bachelors at some future day to meet at the corner of Wall Street or walk the sunny side of Broadway and kill time together. But you and Brevard have given me the slip. 14. It is difficult to credit entirely Irving's claim that he remains single, despite his uxorious constitution, because of lack of means.
Uxorious means you love your wife, or wife-loving.
The success of the sketchbook soon removed that obstacle, yet Irving retained his bachelorhood for another 40 years, resisting repeated encouragements to matrimony. 35. This apparent contradiction was observed by Irving's heirs, and in the words of one scholar, to some plausible story that might account for this persistent bachelor who became the sacred duty of Pierre M. Irving, who elaborated a leg out of the death of Irving's youthful sweetheart Matilda Hoffman. 3. Pierre Irving's romantic tale, it was lifelong grief, not insolvency, kept his uncle avuncular, queer, and rum. Irving's scholarship has never resolved the biographical problem to anyone's satisfaction. More interesting, perhaps, is the letter's contrast between matrimony, which secures the after part of existence, and the life of bachelors who kill time. Irving alludes here to an urban subculture of bachelor life, with an infrastructure of taverns, boarding houses, and street life, a subculture that makes an alternative to patriarchal house. Michael Warner, 783.
Yeah,
Holds
he would have been
imaginable,
such a fucking
even if temporarily.
podcaster.
He is also partly narrating here a change in his own writing, its mutation from genteel diversion into literary career. Brevard and Paulding were among the bachelor collaborators with whom Irving had written Salmagundi. The authors of that work had assured its readers that they wrote neither for fame nor for money. So soon as we get tired of reading our own works, we shall discontinue them without the least remorse. While we continue to go on, we will go on merrily. 37. If Irving began writing out of the bachelor practice of killing time merrily, by the time he wrote the sketchbook he had begun to see his writing as literary property. In a letter to his brother Ebenezer in 1819, he says he is trying to write articles sufficient for my present support and form a stock of copyright property that may be a little capital for me hereafter.
That's what I was going to say before, is that there's it's his story is not unusual, where it's like someone who essentially didn't make it into society becomes like a writer, because you have this like level of consciousness that's outside of like you can view society kind of accurately because you haven't been allowed in. But he does not. Like, you would think that there's some sort of insight on domesticity because he was never a part of it, but he doesn't even try to really describe it accurately. He can't wait to get his character away from that, like, and essentially be where he is, which is alone.
Right.
Which I always think is kind of interesting.
Which is, I mean, aren't we all alone?
No,
I'm sleeping through the revolution. Anyway, Alex, we're going to wrap up this Rip Van Winkle one and come back with Sleepy Hollow, but thank you very much for joining me again.
Sounds good.